Hello, and welcome to our second session, introducing the Bible, starting to have a look in a very brief way from a kind of a great distance without a huge amount of detail as to how this book came to be the collection of books that it is, what it means, not so much in religious language, but what it tells us about the authorship of it and the study of it as a part of biblical studies, part of a discipline of coming at literature, the Bible in particular in this case, as a piece of literature, to look at it as a whole, to look at it in parts, to see if we can tell the story of how it came to be as it is, which is not to ask what religious significance it necessarily has, but to say how did the story get to be told into the form that we have it now, in the authoring, the editing, and the arriving into into the many thousands of pages between the covers of a large and complex book. So last week I just did a kind of overview of all of Scripture and laid out a bit of a roadmap for what we're going to do with the Bible over the next 8 weeks, beginning today. And today we're going to be spending some time with the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which are called the Pentateuch, literally 5 scrolls, 5 teachings. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Books that are at the very core of Jewish faith, and that contain a particular story. It's a complex story. It happens over many generations, but fundamentally, the first 5 books of the Old Testament are the story of the birth of a nation, the story of the birth of a race, the story of the birth of a people who consider themselves a people under God. It's also a story about the formation of a religious culture, of a religious structure, of a set of very defined religious practices that help the nation to understand itself as unique and special, and set aside in some ways as God's chosen people. It's also a story in those 5 books about the founding of values, and what the nation believes to be true about God, about themselves, about strangers and foreigners and others, about the roles of men and women in their society and their religious practice, and children. It's very much about the moral underpinnings of a nation's identity. And it's the story of a journey back to God. It begins in Genesis, in the creation stories, with Adam and Eve and a snake and an apple or another fruit of your choice. But it begins with either, if you understand that literally, a literal fall from grace, or some kind of symbolic, helpful mythological understanding of how we got to be people whose lives are hard and who find ourselves in a tenuous relationship with God, even if it just feels like that to us, and that's all that we know. It's a journey back to God. It's a journey from a number of small individual people through the stories of the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who are the beginnings of the locus of a promise that God makes to these people, and how that develops into to the nation of Israel, and to what it means for Israel to be not just a nation under a man whose name is changed to Israel, but a people, a culture, a tribe, an ethnicity, and eventually, as we find them on the brink of what is the promised land at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, a geography, a physical place, a country, a piece of land that God has entrusted to them, given to them, set aside for them. So we'll look a bit at authorship, where we think these texts come from, how they go from being fireside stories into the final written form that we have them now. And we'll also look at some of the literary devices that are part of them, some of the ways of writing that shape and reinforce the intentions of the authors and the way that they go about saying the things they want to say, with the emphases that they decide and choose, whichever corner they're coming from, to help those who read these stories, those who hear these stories, to understand them as foundational, to understand them as absolute in some ways. in the way that they describe themselves as a people and their relationship with God. We will begin with Genesis in a few moments, and the stories in Genesis are common fodder in a Sunday school environment. They are rich, imaginative stories, not imaginary stories. That's not what I said, but they are stories that are not hard to engage with in an imaginative way, because they are enormously full of action and intrigue and adventure, and we have all kinds of stories that would make fantastic fireside stories in the early days of the Israelites' beginnings, as they sit around their campfires and tell their children, themselves and each other the stories that help them to know who they are. If you've seen the film Noah, which was panned pretty much by the critics and a little bit, I have only seen bits of it, but a little bit dramatic. There is a really powerful moment in it where Russell Crowe, who plays Noah, sits and tells around the fire, tells his children the story of the creation. And Genesis begins there, and then we move through the stories of Adam and Eve, through the story of Cain and Abel, through the story of the Tower of Babel, into all that comes after, and the establishment of a people under God. It's a story of enslavement, of liberation. It's a story of lineage. Time and again, we pause in the storytelling to remind ourselves and to be reminded who was born of who was born of who was born of who, so that there is a bloodline through the purity of the promise that God has made. And it's incredibly important, that sense of lineage, and of blessing and of favor, and how Israel falls in and out of favor with God in the course of becoming the people of God, the Jewish people. It's a story that would originally have been told and told and told, probably for most of its life. All the stories that we have in those books would have been part of an oral tradition, part of, as I've said already, fireside tales, teaching tales within religious settings, tales that would have been passed on orally from generation to generation, but that came to be written down and shaped and then finalized into the form we have. We think around the 5th or 6th century before the birth of Jesus. So in terms of some of their lifetimes, quite recently, when it comes to the amount of time that they've been told the stories before then. We're also reading in these 5 books, as we are in lots of other bits of the Bible as well, but we're reading here a story about purity, racial purity, religious purity, purity before God, purity in shunning otherness, suspicion of other nations and other peoples. We're talking about a story that involves, as I said, racial, cultural, social, religious purity as an essential part of maintaining a distinctive identity as a people. And a people who, through good and ill, in slavery in Egypt and outside of it, before and after, keep asking themselves, who are we? Where have we come from? And what are the stories that help us to know that we are within God's promise, we have fallen out of God's promise, or there is work to do for us in coming into a new covenant with God as part of continuing the faithfulness of that promise. And so in a moment we're going to spend a bit of time with those 5 books, and I'll give you a very brief outline of what's in each. But we're covering over 200 pages of the Bible that I have and use most often in describing these 5 books. There's a lot that happens in them, and they are complex and interesting on the whole. And I hope that what I share with you perhaps gives you reason even just to dip into those books again and explore the pattern of some of the stories that they tell. Because of course when we read them in church, what we do is we read little sections of them. We don't read them as a whole. We don't read them in extended readings. We have them as part of an Old Testament lesson on a Sunday usually, where we will reflect on a passage that seems to speak out of the Old Testament to the Gospel and the New Testament passage that we're reading. And so we often just get little slivers, little windows into a big narrative that is about a people coming to be a people from the beginnings of time in their understanding, and their arrival onto the very brink of their settled status as the nation Israel, and the building of what for them they hope will be some kind of empire. We'll begin, of course, in the book of Genesis. The first book of the Torah, the 5 books that are the Pentateuch, that the Jewish community would call the Torah, divisible into 2 parts really. There's sort of what's called the primeval history, chapters 1 to 11, and then the ancestral history. So as I've said, a series of chapters that introduce how human beings came to be as they are, and then moving into the ancestral history, the way that they understand themselves as a nation under God, in relationship with God, the birth of a nation, a race, a people, and the lineage that is part of that story. The book begins with the accounts of the creation, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and it's commonly agreed that Genesis 1 is the newer of the 2 and Genesis 2 the older. That in fact Genesis 1 may well be as the story that sets the creation sets the creation story into the 7 days, the very ordered explanation of the creation, rather than Genesis 2's more poetic, relational explanation. That arose during the Babylonian exile, or at a time when the Jewish people needed to retell the story around the fire in a way that helped them to know themselves. And part of what helped them to know themselves was their practice of the Sabbath. And so they retell the story. They retell the story of the creation in such a way as to highlight that which set them apart as a people in faith with God. And they tell it so that the Sabbath is prominent within that. We have in the story in Genesis, we have through the beginnings of it, the creation. We have the story of Noah and the flood, beyond the story of the fall and Adam and Eve as symbolic or real human beings cast out from within God's promise because of their misbehavior, their disobedience, through to the story of the Tower of Babel, again a historical or mythological explanation of the diversity of language and culture and race in the world. And then we come into the beginnings of the ancestral history, which is about Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and how in that father, son and grandson we have the beginnings of the unpacking of the promise of God. Firstly to Abraham, who as Abram with his wife Sarah leaves from his home into Canaan, lives as a sojourner, lives as a person kind of on his way, and then it gives birth to Isaac and then to Jacob. And we see how the birthright, the inheritance of that promise from Abraham to Isaac, is then subverted in the story of Jacob, who steals his brother's birthright. And once that's done, that can't be changed. Jacob's name is changed to Israel, and so Israel as a nation take their name from the character of Jacob. Now he had all of his sons, all 12 of them, and Joseph, one of those, is, if you know the story through the musical or elsewhere, it's again a very colourful, gripping story. He's sold into slavery by his jealous brothers because he's dad's favourite, even though he's one of the youngest. And he goes, he's sold into slavery in Egypt, and in Egypt comes into the king's favour because of his ability, God-given ability, to interpret dreams and to save the nation from a famine that is coming. His father hears that there's grain in Egypt, and so sends the sons on to go and beg for grain, beg to buy grain so that they might survive. And in the course of that, Joseph is reconciled with his family and with his father, and his family move to Egypt. A number of, literally just dozens of people, 70 to 100 people, with their households, entirely move into the land of Egypt and start to live in the promise of greatness that is theirs. And that's more or less what's in Genesis. There are a series of covenants with God, narrowing in scope from all of humankind with Noah to a very special relationship with one people, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and through them their descendants. And then we move on to Exodus, where the political landscape has changed and a new Pharaoh has decided that the Israelites are not welcome guests or even at home, but helpful slaves, and so has in a cruel way enslaved the nation. And that begins the great story of the calling of Moses, and Moses as this great figure in Jewish history who leads the people out of Egypt into the beginnings of the approaches of the promised land through the wilderness. And that narrative continues over all 4 books that remain, right to the edge of the Jordan River, the edge of of the Israelites looking into the Promised Land and Moses making some great speeches in the course of them beginning to move into it. In Exodus, we find a very dramatic story, the story of the plagues, the story of the interactions between Moses and Pharaoh, and God essentially rescuing the people out of slavery. Israel as a nation enters into a covenant with God, who gives them their laws, instructs them to build the tabernacle. In the story, they are given the Ten Commandments. They are given those commandments on tablets of stone. They receive instruction to build the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle, and they continue in the wilderness as a wandering, sojourning people, perhaps encamped for years at a time, even in particular places, but not at home yet, and traveling between where they've been and where they're going to end up. Again, it's traditionally ascribed the writings to Moses himself, but it's not at all clear who the authors are or how that's been influenced. And then we come to Leviticus, and Leviticus is really a book of instruction on how to use the tabernacle, which they've just built. In the first part of Leviticus, they build the tabernacle and they begin to use it. And there are rules about how it is to be used. And if you don't know what the tabernacle is, it was their very first expression of all that it meant for them to be God's people in a way that was bound up in a particular historical moment, but also in a kind of traveling temple that they took with them, in which they housed the Ark of the Covenant containing the Ten Commandments. So as we begin to think about the formalizing of religious practice within this traveling people, here are some images of the tabernacle. This is a picture by a man called William Dix, who was an illustrator and writer and a painter and otherwise in the 19th century, and looking at the dimensions and the instructions in the first part of Leviticus as to exactly what the tabernacle would look like, following on from the book of Exodus and how that begins to concretize and make solid in the minds of Israel the place of this locus, this place where God is to be visibly known and seen among them. He came up with this illustration. You see in it that there's a sort of a screen surrounding it through which only certain people could enter, and ritual purification required. You'll see that there's an altar with smoke coming off it for the burnt offerings. Behind that, a large, what looks like sort of basin, which would have been for ritual purification. And then the tent of meeting, which as part of its interior would have had the Holy of Holies, screened off, in which the Ark of the Covenant was kept and only Moses could go into, and the high priests, as they developed their priestly habits and their priestly tradition as part of their life. And you see the smoke, not because there's a fire, but because God promised to be with them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And so above the Ark of the Tabernacle, above the Ark, above the tent of meeting in the tabernacle, the story tells us there was this visible sign of God present with the people. There's another picture of the tabernacle I want to show you, which is a bit less, a bit less accurate, in that the Israelites didn't camp in nylon tents with large fake Roman villas in the background. This is in the United States some years ago, and this is literally someone's backyard. They decided to build for their own religious exploring and the exploring of others who wanted to be devout in their understanding of the Jewish tradition as part of their Christianity, built this tabernacle in their back garden. And I think people could come and could camp out in the tents and take part in exploring the tabernacle and what it was about. But there you are. There's a physical modern rendition of the tabernacle, which traveled with the Israelites through the desert. So we're in Leviticus, which, as I've said, is primarily about the way that the Israelites understand their use of the tabernacle and set about formulating and formalizing their religious rituals around the tabernacle. Chapter 70 to 26 are called a holiness code. There's a detailed list of rewards for following God's commands. There are detailed lists of punishments for not following them. And in Leviticus, the establishment of sacrifices at the tabernacle as an everlasting practice and culture and habit and necessary requirement within the Jewish people's faith in God is established. And we move on to Numbers. Numbers, which is the fourth book, a book with a very long, a complex history. In its final form, shows evidence of a lot of editing. Numbers begins at Mount Sinai. It begins at the place where the Ten Commandments are given, and in a mixture of historical storytelling about how the Israelites move on from there, and again more teaching about how they use their faith, how they express themselves towards God, how they build and function in their community as a religious people, as a culture, as a society, as a nation, as a race. Numbers is full of quite specific instruction. It's in many ways the culmination of the story of the Exodus from Egypt, because the journey ends in Numbers. They find themselves at the end of Numbers on the brink of taking possession of the land God has promised to their fathers. So it draws to a conclusion some of the themes in Genesis and played out in Exodus and Leviticus. God promises the Israelites that they'll be a great nation, and this is part of them arriving to the point where they're about to enter into the land of Canaan, which is Abraham's historical place of settling. And Numbers also continues the theme of holiness, continues the theme of faithfulness, continues the theme of trust. But what we find in Numbers is that God is not happy with Israel. That in the grumbling and the doubting and the struggling in their journey through the desert, part of what happens in the course of Numbers is that God becomes frustrated with those who are doing that grumbling, and so says to the people, essentially, you're going to wander in the wilderness until those of you who set out from Egypt have all died, and a new generation will be those who inherit the promise and move into the promised land as part of arriving into all that I've said through Abraham, Isaac and Jacob and all of your history is your destiny and is your gift. And then we come to Deuteronomy, which is an interesting book in that it is largely formed of two major speeches delivered to the Israelites by Moses. The setting is the plains of Moab, shortly before they enter the promised land. And in those addresses, in those sermons, in those speeches, he recounts the 40 years of wilderness wanderings. He talks about how they've got to this place. He continues to offer an explanation and an encouragement to observe the laws and the teachings. And he goes on to remind the Israelites that they need to follow God. They need to follow the laws and the teachings. That the covenant is something that is lived from both directions, and that their obedience to that is going to decide whether they get to keep possession of the land that God is giving to them. And then he goes on to say to them, but even if all of that goes wrong, God is with you, and God will continue to redeem you, and with repentance you can be restored. We then find right at the end of the book of Deuteronomy what's called the Song of Moses, the blessing of Moses. And it in a sense is part of Moses passing on the mantle of leadership to Joshua, and part of him in a poetic form telling the story again and exploring his own experience of the story of being the person he's been in this time of history. God had said to Moses some time before in one of the other parts of the story that Moses himself would not enter the promised land, that Moses would not get to set foot on the promised soil that was Canaan. And so the very last act that happens in Deuteronomy and in the Pentateuch is the death of Moses, which is recorded not by Moses, but some would say by Joshua, who comes after him as the leader of the people. And that Joshua and the priests and those who carry on into the promised land make sure that Deuteronomy ends with a fitting epitaph to Moses and his leadership. So there you have it. In about half an hour, a whirlwind tour through about 200 pages of the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible that I've got, more or less pages depending on which translations you read and how big they are and how big the type is. But a really fast-moving, deep, complex story of a nation finding its identity from the very beginnings of creation and their understanding of themselves as a nation under God, right through their the promises of God, their enslavement in Egypt, their liberation from that, on the brink of moving into what will be a stable, prosperous kingdom, everlasting kingdom, if they keep the demands of the covenant from their side. The story ends with optimism and with hope, even though it ends with the death of Moses. And as you can see from that synopsis, and if you page through any of it and look beyond all the incredible detail as to how you do which little bit of temple observance on any given day or festival, you see a people telling itself, retelling itself again and again. How did we come to be who we are? This nation, this race, this people under God. So if you want to explore this some more, just type Pentateuch into any search engine and you'll find all kinds of interesting things. The Wikipedia page on the Pentateuch itself is a good place to look. It's worth saying in terms of authorship, as a final note, that scholars recognize within the 5 books of the Bible, and then some that come after, they recognize a number of different voices. So if the same story was being told around different fires, different people would tell it quite differently, with different emphases. And so 4 emphases, 4 different clues as to which window we're looking into when it comes to how the story coalesces into the Bible and these books as we have them right now. So again, scholars aren't entirely agreed about these 4. Some think that there would be 3 and can't decide about which should be left out. But we find in at least 2 of the original scrolls, we find God consistently referred to by 2 different names, Yahweh or Elohim. And the way that the Yahwist and the Elohist voices speak into the story about God and about the people, there are variations and there are differences. And so it seems obvious to those who are scholars of the literature that at least these 2 voices have been part of an oral tradition and then a written tradition that through the course of time, until about the 5th or 6th century before Jesus, were shaping the story from different perspectives, and that those perspectives exist. We do not have a consistent story told from one point of view all the way through. Equally, there is a priestly tradition within this, a style of writing that suggests one of the sources had as its focus almost entirely the place of the priesthood, not as an authoritarian sort of overlord of the people, but that the role of the priest in the sanctification, the cleansing, the righteousness of the people, that the role of the priest and the priestly functions is enormously important. And the priestly tradition speaks into much of these 5 books. And then lastly, the Deuteronomist or the Deuteronomistic tradition, which accounts for most of, unsurprisingly, the book of Deuteronomy, but then also Joshua, Judges, and parts of what come after into the histories. That has as a particular focus this covenant, this relationship established and expressed and made real in the lived witness and leadership of the person of Moses and into the future. So again, if you want to explore that a bit, you could type Yahwist, Elohist, Deuteronomist, or priestly tradition into any search engine. Or you could just type in JEDP with a space between them. And you'll find all kinds of articles from all kinds of points of view again. People telling the story of how we understand those sources, those primary sources that have come together to shape the story in the way that it is. Oral traditions that become written traditions that somehow together coalesce into what we have. And it's always helpful, isn't it? It's always helpful to think about how someone else tells the same story that we want to tell, because their own emphasis, their own decisions about what matters most shape the way we understand more of the story than we would on our own. So there you are. There you are. We've gone from the creation right to the edge of Canaan, the plains of Moab, and we've seen a nation discovering themselves, expressing themselves, telling their story to themselves, to the point where they are sure that this, in the way we have those books now, is the story of the establishment of the nation, the race, the people of Israel, the Jewish people, and what it means for them to keep reflecting on who they are and how they came to be. So that's it for this week. I hope that's been a little bit interesting and made you a little curious. Leviticus, Numbers, and bits of Deuteronomy do not make thrilling bedtime reading, but it is worth flicking through or maybe reading through in greater chunks than we do in church often, because we read little bits, and getting a sense of the narrative and the flow of this great story, which is the birth of a people, a nation, and a faith. I'll be back next week with the next section of the Old Testament, which is largely historical literature, again unpacking the story of how Israel settles into itself as a nation and establishes kings and establishes rules and becomes a large and prosperous, on the whole, nation. How it organizes itself and how it tells itself the story of how it fights off the enemies and goes about establishing its place within God's covenant. But more of that next week. That's been enough for this week. And thanks for watching. Cheers.